Hello, and welcome to this session by the Community-Based Catalog of Requirements for Trustworthy Technical Repository Service Providers Working Group. This is a working group that focuses on developing modular certification recommendations that capture the status and level of certification for repositories and service providers. And the group is also interested in increasing the efficiency in repository certification with the aim that a service is certified once and repositories using the service can reference service certification. My name is Lisa Letzelo. I'm with RDA Europe and I'll be sharing the session a bit today and providing the slides from my computer. But the session will be then run by the working group co-chairs, who I will introduce in a second. As you heard, the session is recorded, so if you don't want your face video up here, please kindly feel free to switch off your video. There are collaborative notes. The link is in the chat, and the link should directly take you to the repeat session sign in. So please leave your name and your contact details so that we could get back in touch with you afterwards. And if you also could contribute to collaborative note taking, that would be great. So this is a working group that is still in the making. The group is co-chaired by Wim Hugo from Dams in the Netherlands, Alison Lister from Oxford E-Research Centre in the UK, Lauren Maxwell from Heidelberg University Hospital in Germany, Mohan Ramamuti from Unidata Program Center at the University Corporation for Atmospheric Research in the US, and Max Wilkinson from Australian Research Data Commons from Australia. The working group is supported also by the RDA Tiger project, coordinated by RDA Europe, where Ryan O'Connor and myself are facilitating this group. We do have quite a packed schedule today, and the focus of the session will be inviting your input on the working group's case statement that is currently being finalized and ready for submission and community review. After the introductions, Lauren will give some background and rationale for this working group, and then Wim will take us through the case statement and invite your feedback. And we end the session with open discussion that today Alison will lead. But before we get into this program, we wanted to very quickly get a sense of this virtual room this morning. So if you could join the Mentimeter, the whole session will be run from Mentimeter, so there will be lots of opportunities for you to contribute. So kindly ask you to enter there either by scanning the QR code or entering the numerical code, which you'll continue to see on the screen throughout the presentation. I see that one person has hit thumbs up, so at least one person has their way there.
Can you put the number in the chat, please?
Yes, in a second.
It will be easier.
Yes, it's there now. And then we have the first question is, we just would like to know where you're based. We have our expectation given the time zone that this session is taking place, but So we are quite Europe focused this morning, more so than it was last week, where there was a greater presence also from Oceania. And unfortunately, we have missed our friends from the Americas completely. And then we would like to know which stakeholder group you represent. And if you have responded other, we'll kindly ask you to, if you so wish, to indicate your affiliation or your, which stakeholder you are in the chat. So we have a sense. But there's a lot of repository managers and also repository service providers in the room today, which especially more service providers than there was last week. So we're happy to see a slightly different audience, which for our purposes of getting feedback, it's good. So with this, we welcome all of you again and get into the session proper with Lauren first. I'm sorry, it's been a short night for me as well. With Lauren starting first by giving a bit of background to this working group and the rationale as to why it's been called into life.
Great, thanks so much, Lisa. So I would say we started this conversation, at least within this group, at the last in-person RDA, which was in Austria, of last year with the Birds of a Feather. So we had a number of really productive discussions at the Birds of a Feather about what are the main challenges that we see in the repository certification landscape and what could be some ways forward. So the work that we've done to date on the draft case statement and then in trying to establish this working group came out of that Birds of a Feather at the last RDA. So Lisa, you could go to the next slide. Okay, great, I forgot this slide. So one thing that we were interested in thinking about today is just what, within the room, how do we define a repository? So setting aside certification, just we'd love to get your responses on how you define a repository. So this would be the same Mentimeter that that we used for the last set of questions. Great. So we see a couple of similar keywords to what we saw last week, which is long-term storage. So something for digital research objects, not just data. It's great. Again, long-term preservation of digital research objects. Long-term storage, the purpose of retention and reuse, and then again, long-term storage and creation. So what we want to do with this question is just take a moment to reflect on how we think of repositories and then what we know of repository certification. So what are the different aspects that we consider when we're thinking about repository certification? So missing just from this really brief list is something related to sustainability, although that comes in with the long term. Yeah, so this is great. Thanks for your responses here. Yeah, and then the reason that we see this group as being important is obviously we have had a lot of investment in these certification schemes, so Core Trust, Seal, Nestor, ISO, and there's been a lot of thought and kind of person power behind the development of those certification schemes, but we see a very limited amount of uptake. And so when we look at just the repository landscape, we have this iceberg diagram that Wim put together, where we can see that we have very few repositories that are currently certified. And then we have many, many more repositories that have registered themselves on R3 Data or DataCite or Fair Sharing. And then we have many, many more repositories that are not registered. So we don't have, we may not have a DOI for those repositories. But those repositories are fulfilling the needs of folks for data deposition. They just may not know about certification or may not want to become certified for different reasons, or there may be important barriers to certification. So what we're interested in here is thinking about how can we ensure that the supply of certified repositories better meets the demand. So we have a tremendous amount of demand for trusted repositories because we have a tremendous amount of data sets that are being registered. So just looking at Zenodo or DataCite or Figshare, we have millions and millions of data sets that are being uploaded. And that is just a subset probably of the number of data sets that should be uploaded to repositories given the number of publications that we have annually. So that's exceeding 5 million. And so we can see that the demand for trusted repositories is nowhere near what we have in terms of repositories that have been certified. So you can go to the next slide. So in thinking about what are the key issues in terms of repository certification, we'd like to get your feedback on what you see as some of the priorities here for addressing certification and trying to ensure that the supply of certified repositories better meets that demand for data deposition. So again, this would be in Mentimeter, the same code that we used before. Great. So we see here, and I think this is also similar to what we saw last week, that one of the main issues is that we don't have schema that support modular certification, which is related to what we have now, which is binary certification. So we don't have different levels of performance. We see that the cost and time required for certification is cited as perhaps the most important issue. And then also lack of awareness is another important issue that's being highlighted here. So interesting that all of these have been chosen by some folks, but those are the most important. Next slide. So what we're looking at here is basically the system, or let's say a system level view of the demand and the production of uncurated data, and then the supply of curated and certified repositories. So in the upper part of this diagram, in demand, we're thinking about the process of producing data, curating that data. So oftentimes those data are self-curated. There may be formal curation, by repositories or other staff, they're data that are crowd curated. And then in terms of repositories, we have repositories that are accepting uncurated data. We have repositories that are accepting curated data that are not certified. And then we have repositories that are certified with curated data, and we have services available to repositories. So we understand that this is a system with a lot of moving parts. And the part that we'd like to focus on in this working group is the part in the yellow rectangle, where we're focusing really on A, B, and C, which stand for the rate of certification. So trying to address the cost and the time associated with certification, that binary issue where it's either certified or not certified, which may set the bar too high for certain registries and doesn't let us know whether or not some components of certification are met, and then the certification capacity of different groups. So B stands for the scope of certification, so the types of outputs that are certified and the modularity or granularity of that certification. And then we'd also like to consider in this working group the inclusion of service providers as part of that initiative towards modular certification of registries. So that's the specific space that we're interested in working here, and we're setting aside the other parts of the system that also need to be addressed, but wouldn't be within scope here. Next slide. So just given what we've covered so far in terms of the challenges, in terms of just a little bit about our intentions in this working group, we're wondering if there are any issues that you feel like we've left out just in this initial introduction to what we're looking at here. So anything else of interest to folks? Yeah, so bringing visibility to the capabilities and features of non-certified repositories, I think that would be something within scope here that we're interested in working on. Lack of support for repositories that wish to be certified, I think that's a big issue, something that we're not thinking about tackling, but something that does need to be addressed. And then that generalist repositories can be certified. I think that's an interesting point that we need to keep in the mix here, and then federated data repositories. So federated data repositories, would that mean federated reuse of data from repositories? Or I'm just curious what federated data repositories is referring to. And lack of systemic exposure to repository features, that's great. I think that definitely relates to the bringing visibility to end users. And then moving towards community certification rather than certification by an entity that charges for that certification. That's something that I don't think we've talked about explicitly, but it is quite interesting and relates to the lack of support for repositories. So if whoever posted the comment about federated data repositories would like to expand on that, we're happy to just hear further about what that could mean. And you can add a comment to the chat or perhaps unmute yourself, whatever would work best.
Yes, hi, this is Martina. I posted federated repositories for our high volume data. This is hosted at different nodes worldwide under the same principles, so to say. So it's really oriented on where the data is maintained and hosted.
Mm-hmm. So kind of a certification scheme for federated reuse of data that are coming from different, perhaps like we could consider them as nodes of a repository. Okay. Yeah. Yes, I think that federated, so that kind of approach, I think is definitely something we should keep in mind, given the importance of federated data reuse for big data. So makes a lot of sense. Great. Well, thanks everyone who provided your feedback here. This is very helpful, and we'll add this to the other issues that we found from the group last week to think about if we need to add anything to the case statement, which is also open for comments. Great. And then we have a comment in the chat from Francoise that Core Trust Seal is a community endeavor, and there's a need to organize the certification process. So I think that it's a very important comment. Absolutely. Any other comments about other issues?
Mari has her hand up.
Great.
Thank you. So also thank you, Francis, for pointing out that Core Trust Seal is a community endeavor, and I'm a Core Trust Seal member, or board member. So as a background, I think it's also and Core Trust Seal. I don't know if this comment is about Core Trust Seal, but we do charge. But there's always an administrative cost. So when it comes to Core Trust Seal, all the reviewers come from the community, and there's always some cost. And I would also like to comment on that. I agree with the person who has said that they insist that the generalist repositories can be certified. Yes, they can be certified, but I think there's a lack of, when you think about Core Trust Seal, for example, that is very oriented to long-term preservation. So if you don't have that mission, then you can't be certified, but you can provide a very good and excellent service, maybe for a limited time period, and then you don't have any certification schema really that you can use. Thank you.
Mari, thanks for that great point. And I think we've added something here, which is kind of the difference between long-term and shorter-term curation and preservation and sharing. So we can add that in the collaborative notes as well. And then we have from Vim, part of the question is whether CTS cost is reasonable, and whether there's funding available to scale up the rate of certification. So we know from talking to folks that many groups are not aware of Core Trust Seal, they don't budget for Core Trust Seal, and then when they find out about Core Trust Seal, they say that they don't have budget. But I think also we have the burden on the registries and repositories of going through the Core Trust Seal process. So the cost, but also the time that's involved in the cost of that time to get through the certification process. Yep, so that's one from Francois about when preservation is not the mission, but management is well done. I think that's definitely where we'd like to work in this working group to try to build out the number of repositories that can be certified or are certified. Great. Okay. So Lisa, we could move to the next slide. So now we'll get into the case statement review, and Vim will take over from me here. And just quickly, there's a comment from Alison also in the chat about helping databases expose their repository attributes effectively. And I think that goes back to the two comments about making modular certification visible, so we can understand the components that matter most to the end users or to the depositors.
Okay, thanks, Lauren. So Lisa, if you could move to the next slide, we're going to look at a review of the case statement at the end of a number of sections. So the first part in the case statement that we want your opinions and inputs about is in respect of the intentions and outcomes. And as you can see there, our main intent is to broaden the umbrella of trust, and we intend to do that with the items listed on the left-hand side there, establishing a set of modular repository features and characteristics that confirms and assesses the needs and expectations of the community, and determine which of these features can be delegated to, for argument's sake, service providers if need be, and then define and describe alternatives to formal certification that improves the appraisal and selection of repositories for the end user community, even though they may not be formally certified. Or as Mari has pointed out, I mean, it's not out of scope to have a parallel or complementary certification process that excludes some of the features of disciplinary long-term repositories as certified by Core Trust Seal. And then our we're hopeful that we can achieve these outcomes, such as contributing to an improvement of the number and scale of successful certifications on the one hand, also to extend the scope of certification beyond data repositories, at least identifying the common criteria and features that also apply to other types of research outputs, and to assist the community with better informed decisions about the use of infrastructure while the other outcomes are underway or until such time that they can be established. So on the next slide, we're asking for your input and thoughts about these outcomes and intentions, things that we may be missing, potentially a different perspective if need be. So please contribute your thoughts. Yeah, I think it is a little bit ambitious to, all of those outcomes cannot be achieved in 18 months, I agree. But at least we hope to contribute to them. In the work plan, we'll revisit this aspect of what's feasible within the time constraints of a working group in RDA. Okay, we can give another minute or so if you have some extra thoughts. I realize that it's a small group of people, so everyone has to work hard to get our screen filled up. Yeah, another perspective, again, emphasizing that it's difficult work and that we should maybe focus a bit more. I think that's a useful comment. And maybe, yes, also considering when certification is appropriate and when it is not. I think informally already we are starting to talk about what we call appraisal, which is a mechanism for the community to understand the capabilities and features offered by a repository or a service without formal certification necessarily being included in the process. Yeah, changing practices is difficult, so we can come up with very good recommendations and frameworks, but yeah, getting people to change their behavior is always challenging. Yeah. Okay, so I think the long and the short of it is that those outcomes and intentions may be a little bit too ambitious for the time available. And yes, it's good advice, I guess. Okay, then the next slide deals with the value proposition of the working group. So on the left-hand side, we think that we will be contributing in 3 fields. The one is to create an inventory of expectations. In other words, the features and characteristics that people would typically want to see in the repository landscape and the supporting services around repositories, to prioritize it in terms of which of these expectations are more important than others and potentially differentiate them in broad use cases. Alison has made that comment already, but I think given the time constraints, it might not be possible to finally allocate these priorities on the basis of different disciplines and use cases, but one can try. And then to revisit the whole business of appraisal and verification of repositories and services and how they fulfill the expectations of the community. So the community is an important input, and we'll return to this work process later on. But as you can see, there are sort of 5 main outputs that we want to create, deliverables, and we are going to involve the community at least 3 times with wide consultations. So those are the intentions. So on the next slide, broad thoughts on these inventory of expectations that we want to create. Do you think that's a good idea? Are there things that we should take into account? We've listed some of the existing and prior work and ongoing efforts in RDA and elsewhere that we should take into account. But if you have some ideas about how we should go about compiling this inventory of expectations, then please share with us. Give it a little bit more time. Yeah, I think of necessity, one has to start wide, and it might be frustrating and vague. But I think it is equally important, as one of the comments indicates, we have to ask what the community wants, because otherwise we end up designing, high quality frameworks and sets of recommendations, but it doesn't really reflect what the community expects. So it's a balance to do this effectively and widely enough without getting bogged down in or too divergent in the work that we're doing. Okay, so on the next slide, you can share your thoughts about how we should go about prioritization and selection of criteria. So let's say we're successful in compiling an inventory of what the community expects of the repository landscape. How do we go about prioritizing these and figuring out what's applicable and which are more important than the others? Yeah, maybe while you're thinking, some background information that responds to Alison's comment about databases and machine readability. In some of the EU calls that are currently being evaluated, 01 and 03, the 03 proposal in respect of a network of trustworthy repositories in Europe, and then a complementary one to establish infrastructure to support such a network, the 04 proposal. There, our working group has got significant overlap and should engage quite directly with the successful bidders there, because in the one project there is a high probability that they will establish this machine readable type infrastructure to record appraisals or performance of repositories against a set of criteria. Okay, so I think it's probably straightforward, but we are asking the question just in case, because yes, I think that once we have such an inventory, the obvious thing to do is to engage with the community and get as wide as possible an input on priorities. Yeah, so that's an interesting one. There was a report published, or recommendations published some years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, if I recall, on publishers' expectations for repositories. We should certainly revisit that, because that's a different perspective coming from a section of the community. And these are really the ideas of the publishing infrastructure in respect of the data repositories that support peer-reviewed articles, or what should be available from them. So that's a good starting point as well. Okay, we need to move on. So on the next slide, we think a little bit more about this whole question of appraisal and certification. So to date, we've identified these two axes or dimensions, if you will, to say that there can be different bases of appraisal. One could informally just look at desirable features and characteristics, or you can then translate that into best practices and recommendation, hopefully then with community input. And sometimes you can formalize these even more into standards and specifications. And of course, it's a sort of a continuum in many cases. And then the mechanism of appraisal is also, starting from a very informal one or no assessment really to self-assessment, maybe then progressing towards self-assessment with some benchmarking and evidence to back it up, all the way to audited or reviewed assessments, which currently forms the basis of certification. And again, it is more of a continuum, and sometimes there's a mixture of these assessment mechanisms, not so much in the world of trust, but in other domains. So the link between the basis of appraisal and the mechanism of appraisal is some form of community benchmark, for instance, based on maturity levels or any other kind of interpretation or contextualization. So in our next question, we want to ask your input on whether you think any of these need amendment, or whether our thinking is off the mark. And it's a fairly complicated slide to fill in, but the outcome will be quite useful to us. So we ask you to basically evaluate the basis and mechanism of assessment for your current situation, or how you see the landscape at the moment, what you would want to see in future and think is adequate, and what you would think is desirable, even though it may not be achievable. So on the slide, you would be able to see the ways in which you can fill in this, question. So on the first two sliders, you can select a basis and mechanism for the current situation that you think applies, what you would like in future, and what you would like as a desirable outcome. So I'm going to fill it in to create an example, and then we can you can take your input from there. So my perception is that currently the basis for appraisal is that it's based on best practice and recommendations, and it is based on formal certification. And over time, I would like that to move more towards benchmarks and evidence-based assessment, but based more on standards and formal specifications. But that's just my opinion. The other aspect, just to remember, is that we see averages here, but behind the scenes, Menti at least is keeping each tick that you create. So we'll be able to see if there is a difference of opinion in the set of answers. Okay, give it a little bit more time. There is still time available to us. Okay, everybody done? No, not yet. Give it another 30 seconds or so. Okay, thanks. We have a good response rate. All right, and then if we can move to the final question in this particular section in terms of our approaches or how we should look at appraisal and certification. Any other thoughts that you might have? Some of them have been expressed already in the chat or in verbal comments, but these extend to things such as, for argument's sake, that there's different scopes of appraisal and certification depending on the circumstances of the repository and the client base that they are serving. So that's one perspective that I think is already apparent. So I'm adding that thought so that we have it also in the survey. Yeah, I think that first comment is quite important. We see it as a recurring theme, whether it's a fair assessment and evaluation or trustworthiness or anything else for that matter. On the one hand, one doesn't want to be judgmental in many cases and be inclusive and supportive of improvement of practices and allow growth. But on the other hand, you have situations where people claim compliance or alignment without evidence. So you have to find a balance between the two, where if you wish to claim some form of compliance publicly, then you at least have to provide public evidence that you are compliant. Yeah, so the objectivity of assessment is an interesting one because for the work that we're doing in FairCore for EOSC on assessment, we're looking at all kinds of assessment environments, fair, trust, policy compliance, and so on. And the repeatability of assessments is quite an important consideration. But to some extent, you can address that with the types of tests or questions that you ask, ensuring that if different people do the same evaluation, they should more or less most of the time come to the same conclusion. So whether it's done as a self-assessment or not does not really affect the repeatability of the assessment if you structure the tests correctly. I think automation is another important thought because the rate of certification is low in in the current context. And anything that one can do to speed that up, even for the established certifiers such as Core Trust Seal, will be welcome, I would think. Okay, I'm leaving a bit more time for responses. Okay. We've got 6 responses, so I'll allow another 20 seconds or so, and then we can move on. Okay, thank you. So on the next slides, we are looking at the benefits and the value proposition coming from the working group. If we return to our diagram of where we see the activity in the working group focusing on, then we would like to have at least some value in terms of engagement with the community and making sure that we record their expectations and requirements as faithfully as possible. We would also like to provide some inputs to the Horizon Europe projects and engage with them and exchange information once the successful bidders are identified, which should be towards the end of this year. So those projects should kick off towards the end of 2024 or early 2025. And then also to provide some input for certification authorities. And we'll return to that because in the Birds of a Feather sessions that we've had, Cortrasil has indicated, of course, a particular interest in getting feedback from us on the certification of service providers. So that forms part of the formal work plan. So we hope to add value in terms of efficiency of certification, making sure that appropriate criteria can be identified also for non-data repositories, and then consensus on selecting the most appropriate repository for a service or service for a given context. And I think this is quite important because, as I said earlier, at the moment, the community has no or almost no visibility on the capabilities and features offered by non-certified repositories. So if one can improve that situation, it will be very useful. So on the next slide, you can give us your thoughts and inputs and comments in terms of benefits or side effects that we're missing, things that we should focus on that we're not currently considering. Yeah, so I think the point about biases is interesting because, again, this comes down to how you measure things and whether that measurement process or technique introduces any biases on its own. So the care needs to go into devising the way in which the tests and the metrics are composed to try and avoid these biases. Yeah, I think automation is important. And of course, 2 levels of automation. There are ones that don't involve AI. And if one can automate that, it will be very efficient. but some form of machine learning or artificial intelligence has a place, but it introduces additional burdens on us in terms of validation and attribution and verification and so on. Yeah, the comparison aspect is also important. I think one wants to avoid that because what you could try and achieve is to allow people to select repositories without any judgment on their relative value. So if you expose their characteristics and features and attributes, and people can filter on the basis of that to find repositories that are appropriate for their needs, without making any judgment about whether they are better or worse than others, then maybe it's a simple first layer of improving the uptake of repositories that do things well. Yeah, so the comparison, I think if people don't explicitly select to be publicly evaluated in one way or another, then this appraisal or selection method is much less contentious, just to indicate to people what they're getting without making any judgments. Okay, we need to move on a bit. So, as we've said, we have identified quite a few ongoing and recent initiatives that we have to take into account. So we are listing them here for you to have a look at. One of the inputs that are quite important but is not so immediately recent is the report on characteristics of data repositories coming from the publishing industry, which you mentioned earlier, and that we should add to the list. So if you see anything in this list, or if you see anything that's glaringly missing in terms of what initiatives or outputs that we should consider, recent or ongoing, then on the next slide you can let us know about that. Okay, and I'm adding the one about the publication community report so that we don't forget it in the formal results. Yeah, I think the Elixir ones are quite important. It was mentioned in our first session too, because not only does it represent a different approach to assessment, but it is also an example of a community-focused one. So there will be a lot to learn from engaging with them. And in our first session, we were lucky to have people that are quite familiar with that environment that are willing to contribute.
I'll just add here that I'm part of the Elixir interoperability platform for the next few years, and part of the activities around this and the data platform, but less so there, are around revisiting the certification schemes for recommended interoperability resources. And so certainly within that context, I can also provide feedback. I think broadly speaking, there's general consensus that we like it, but that there is a lack of understanding about what it actually means, and there needs to be more transparency around how the measures and the reviews are conducted. So I think there's definitely some scope for overlap.
Yeah. Yeah, the other perspective that's interesting, of course, is that, and we're encountering it in more than one forum or project, is this idea that people can have extended requirements. So they can take something like Core Trust Seal and add 4 or 5 additional criteria for their network or initiative or research infrastructure and so on. So that's also something that we should think about. Francoise, you've got your hand up.
Yes, and I also wrote things on the slide. I think that, you know, in RDA France, but we are not alone. We are discussing and networking the French repositories. Some of them go to formal certification, but all of them are encouraged to use criteria to improve their practices. And I think that whatever you do, we can try to test the ideas with the community in French and in the French context.
Yeah, thanks. Very good.
And Gilles will shout at me eventually because he's here also, and he's my co-chair of that group in RDA France. But Gilles, do you think it would make sense?
Yeah, sure.
You've got
Sorry,
more work to do
I
now.
trouble with my camera. Yeah, sure. We're willing to engage into that. So sure.
Yeah. Okay, and it's maybe an important touch point for us to look if there are other similar arrangements.
Yes.
Francoise, I don't know if you know about any.
Yes, we had in the 10th anniversary set of events, we had an event gathering projects which are organizing support activities at the European, continental, national, or thematic level. So there is something in the list of events organized in the 10th anniversary. It was in November last year.
Okay, cool. Thanks. All right, and then our last question pertaining to the case statement has to do with our work plan. So on the next slide, we show a graphic again of the work plan. On the left-hand side, you can see that there's sort of 3 swim lanes. The one refers to the phases through which we want to work in the working group, more or less 3 to 4 months each in 5 groups. Then the corresponding RDA plenaries, the one that we're currently involved in is our starting point. And then there is a face-to-face meeting in Costa Rica towards the end of the year. And then the International Data Week will be in Australia towards the end of 2025. And that more or less corresponds to the end of the life of the working group as well. So we plan 3 community consultations in our work plan. The graphic on the right-hand side doesn't completely match with the time periods that we show on the left-hand side, but it does more or less. But the important part is that at the request and at the initiative of CTS, at some point when we have prioritized and ranked all of these expectations and requirements and figured out which of them apply to technical service providers, then Core Trust Seal is willing and eager to review that for us and to test it out in one way or another and to provide us with feedback and final inputs for the recommendations that we want to create. So that's a little bit late in the process, maybe in the last 6 months, but I don't think one will be ready with any significant input before then. So inevitably, that's going to be towards the middle part of next year when this will happen. Okay, so if you see anything there that's alarming, I think we have already received feedback in terms of our ambitions that have to be quite focused and scaled down. So maybe exactly how we go about this and the scope of what we do must be realistic in terms of the time frame. But I think the scope of what we want to do in terms of the steps and the outputs that might still be good enough to consider this way. But if you have any ideas or thoughts, please share it with us on the next slide. Françoise?
Yes, just to, I happen to have been a member of a working group which merged Core Trusteel and DSA some years ago in the RDA. And my point is that you have to expect you will be very busy.
Yes.
Because we had meetings twice a month. And I can tell you, we were looking at commas and words, individual words.
Yes, that's true.
And so this is why I am concerned. I am at least one of the persons who expressed concerns about the scope, which is wide, because I remember very well that with a single scope, how do we merge these two things? And how do we merge the process? It was lots of work. So maybe you will have to have specific task forces in the working group to achieve the work. But even with the support from Tiger, I can tell you it will take lots of work from the people who participate. So this is why my advice, but you do what you want, is to try to focus on the key things into 18 months and accept that there can be a following group to do other things, to finish what you had as an possible outcomes now.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's good advice because I was also part of that effort. So you're right. It took quite an intensive effort to merge these two sets of criteria. So we need to be mindful of an unachievable scope. Then geographical representation. Max is here today. I think he's our conduit to Australia at least, and maybe slightly abroad. Max, I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Sure. So there's increasing interest in this region, both in Australia and also in New Zealand. I see Claire Rye is on the call here today. She's with Nessie in New Zealand, which is great. There's been very much interest in this that's come out of some activities that are concerned about scaling and how stable sector repositories are. So where the interests that I have in particular come from that direction. So I'm hoping to be able to contribute components here to this working group.
And then Mohan Rumamarty in the US, he's not able to join us, but he would be, at least I think, a fairly valuable connection into the climate science community. And of course, we could potentially also talk to institutions or networks that are invested into the trustworthy repository environment, such as World Data System. And there is a parallel effort in RDA already involving, amongst others, the World Data System to look at the trust principles and how that is established more definitively. So we could potentially also use that mechanism. Okay, so I'm slightly over time, but we're a small group, so I'm going to hand over to Alison. Thanks for all your inputs. And Alison will lead us in an open discussion.
Yes, in fact, there's no real worry about time anyway, because we've been participating in the discussion really as you've gone through all the slides, both of you. And And I'm happy to have the time used as we wish. As you say, we're a small group, and it's a lot nicer to be able to see where the discussion takes us. We have prepared a few prompting questions, but we've already seen some areas of discussion, you know, around exposure of attributes, around the scope of the working group, around relationships to sort of implementation, you know, integration with Core Trust Seal, who so kindly agreed to participate, but also what the future of this could look like more broadly with different domains. Does anyone have any particular topic that they would like to bring up before, you know, before I sort of move to our prompts, if there's something that this discussion so far has made you think about a little more? That's no problem at all. I'm just going to bring up the participant list. Oh, yes, we've got, sorry, go ahead. I was just going to say, we have got one hand up, please.
Yeah, so what I wanted to gather some input about is, I mean, there is this consideration that we should look at technical service providers, and in the last, in the previous engagement or session, we asked people to provide us with service providers that they're aware of or are currently using. But I'm curious to know from the current session participants whether they can provide us with lists or pointers to such service providers that we should try and engage with, because the service providers have been largely absent in our sessions.
And that's really, please do put some in the comments. Also, if Lisa, you move on to the next question, I was just going to say the previous, yes, that's the one. Then absolutely fill in the answer here, because there's also a related question we can get to afterwards, which was about the criteria that might apply to technical service providers that doesn't apply to repositories. But so while you guys are thinking of any additional ones and putting them into Menti, Francoise has her hands up, so please go ahead.
Yes, it's just to say that in quite another context in France, we are selecting, the ministry is selecting local workshops to support people in their data management. And there are two levels. Some are accepted and some are on their way to being accepted. And it's very powerful, because it says that the work is already of quality, and it motivates people to go further. So, you know, it's not a very complicated diagram where you have 5 on one note and 2 on one and so on. But there are, of course, considerations about what to improve, but to be on the way to, it can be said outwards, and it helps to motivate people to go further. So this is why having levels and again, not eventually this complex, you can have a complex diagrams, but to have also something which is a feeling based on criteria that people are on their way is a good point.
I strongly agree, Francoise. I think this is really important, and I think that we should try very hard, and I think probably most people agree, to not be too prescriptive in whatever we come up with, because as we've already discussed, there are different communities with different needs, and the ability to just sort of provide. Go ahead.
I think we have to be prescriptive for the higher level, but we have to be, I am absolutely not saying you have to say it's enough to stay at a lower level. So I think we have to keep the higher level with criteria and detailed evaluation, but we have to allow an intermediary level or intermediary levels, which is what was proposed, and I strongly agree with that as a motivation, using it as a motivation and also information for the users.
Yes, I was more meaning towards different however you want to slice the word community, different communities and domains might have requirements.
But staying prescriptive as a whole, and then allowing steps.
Anyone else would like to comment? Because that's quite an interesting topic. Yes, I think that the sort of top level of alignment with whatever attributes we provide is very important, but having the different groupings of attributes for different domains might also, whether or not we implement them, whether we just say that's an option for future work. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so the other thing that we didn't have time to talk about in the previous session is where people think this additional information should be based about repositories. Let's say one is successful in defining the types of attributes and features that needs to be known to make proper selection or appraisal. I mean, because there are options such as fair sharing and re-free data or DataCite that already have registries of repositories. Would one want to engage with them to extend the attributes, or will it be a separate service that can be pointed to from those registries? How do we see this?
I think that's an interesting discussion to have, absolutely. From the singular, just the one individual point of view, project point of view, one of the reasons I'm so interested in this working group is because fair sharing would very likely wish to implement whatever outputs are produced by the working group, but that's just an individual decision from our project, and certainly not something that I would, then say has greater consequences outwards. Certainly if some other alternative, I would expect a lot of the other resources to want to do registries to do similar things, but
yeah. The other possibility that has recently become interesting is Herbert van der Sompel and colleagues have published a draft specification for something called affordances, which is a machine actionable way to go to a repository and find out stuff about that repository in a structured way. So one of the other options one could have is to publish a schema for repositories to implement, but which can be found by machines, let's say being redirected from re-free data or fair sharing or wherever. And this is slightly more efficient because then the information is maintained at source and it's not duplicated in different repositories. I'll see if I can find a reference to that.
Yeah, I should add to that. The EOS task force work on admittedly, this is around fair assessment, and the discussion in chat is very clear about the differences between what we're doing in fair assessment. I'm not trying to do that, but the methodology they're using is signposting, and that's got a very sort of straightforward way of pulling information automatically from registries like fair sharing. And so looking at signposting as a technology sounds similar to what you're talking about in terms of these affordances, which I haven't heard of, but I'd be very much interested in reading more.
Yeah, so the affordances is sort of repository level signposting instead of object level signposting. Sorry,
but it's great that we have options. I think that's good. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
As a repository manager, I would really like to have this information maintained by us. So I like the idea of having a schema and then that we would maintain and others could harvest. Because now it's a pain. The information is all around in different registries, and some of them you maintain yourself, others not, and yeah, it's really
definitely. I mean, it's the layer of extra sort of provision of the attributes, Mary, and into something like fair share or re3 data, whether or not you have the ability to edit it yourself, which depends on the registry, is I can see frustrating for repository managers. And certainly if there was, as we are hoping there will be, the ability to signpost, or I don't know, afford, what's the right verb to use, these attributes through schema.org or some other methodology that we were talking about here. And then as a registry owner, I'd be very happy to be able to harvest that information and then indicate to our team when that information differs from what we have on record. So that still gets the benefit of both. Yeah,
I think it's a win-win, and it would also be a win for certification bodies like,
Yes.
for example, CotraSeal that would allow a lot more automated assessments or part of the assessments. I don't think everything can necessarily be automated, but a lot of could.
Yeah, I'm just thinking that simple things like, here is a URI or a URL that points to my mission statement. Those things have to be captured manually at the moment by people seeking certification from CotraSeal. So a lot of the evidence can be standardized in such a schema, even though it has to be reviewed for certification. It's not a problem to maintain and obtain that information.
I think somebody earlier mentioned, maybe it was a comment, gaming, and I think that's a real thing that we see happening in the FAIR scheme already. So I mean, it's sort of fun, but it's also, if for example funding decisions are based on scores, then that it's sort of, then the scores really don't do anything or tell anything if you can game them easily, which you can do at the moment.
Yeah, I think I used the word gamification on one of my comments. Absolutely. The worry is that people will, what's the word? Study for a test, so, to study for the test and not the knowledge. I'm not the right phrase here, but the best way I try to present it in the context of FAIR is that, unlike this, where we will want a top tier, there's very valid reasons why not completely complying with either open or FAIR is the right decision. And so the spectrum is more appropriate, and the fact that you shouldn't get like an extra gold star because you're 100% on some kind of FAIR evaluation tool. But I think it's important to consider that people, sometimes it can be a strong motivator, having these things and seeing the percentage go up of compliance, but other times it can be detrimental. So yes, it's an interesting discussion to have as we go through.
And I mean, any kind of criteria certification, it should be seen as a tool for improvement.
Yeah, it's quite a positive thing often when I'm trying to tell people that it's okay to not be completely fair. That it's the same here. It's okay to not, once we have our outputs, to not be completely there yet, as Francoise was so kindly saying earlier about how they do it with the French repositories. And I think that's really, really good. Lauren.
Yeah, so I think I was the only researcher here, or data depositor perhaps. And the problem for us in the health space is that people just don't necessarily care about this certification. So I don't know that it's that they don't care, it may be that they don't know. And so I think the comments about making the metadata more visible through fair sharing or R3 data, the modular criteria that we're talking about would be very helpful. But on the other hand, I think that there has to be more advocacy with funders or with journals, or perhaps with fair sharing and R3 data, that like to push folks towards any kind of certification. So when we looked at COVID-19 related platforms and repositories, in the universe of like 400 of those that we found, there was one that had certification. So I think that it's also this need to get the repositories themselves interested in certification, and then obviously the end users and the depositors, but more of like the social side, I'd say.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff happening. Where did I see? Oh, the FAIR Accelerator, the FAIR Data Accelerator. I've seen a presentation of recently. It's all about the social side of engaging and improving people's feelings on and application of FAIR. And again, I don't want to divert too much from our particular topic, and we all realize that FAIR is not the same as what we're doing here, but that kind of social aspect, I think, is really important, and often something that we overlook as people who are so deeply embedded within the RDM ecosystem. Go ahead. Yep, off you go, Ben.
Yeah, so one of the other things that I'm worried about is if you think back at our sort of process diagram with what we call uncurated flows. which we are not looking at the moment. But end users have no interest in any of the things that we're discussing because they want a persistent identifier for their data set to send to the publisher of their paper, and they want it immediately. And that's why there is an enormous flow of data deposits to uncurated environments such as Zenodo, because you can get a persistent identifier even before the data set has been published, a placeholder. So that's a significant practical issue for any kind of repository that wants to perform curation or quality assessment before they publish something and provide a persistent identifier, is that timing issue in terms of what end users actually want. And we're not going to address it in this working group, but this is the elephant in the room, I think.
I think it's a very good point, and I put it in the notes because it's quite often you get policy, the directives come from the policy direction, whether that's institutions or whether that's journals, that will say, yes, you can deposit it somewhere generalist, but you must also deposit in a domain-specific repository.
Yeah.
That can work, but often it's suggestions rather than mandates, and often it is silently ignored. So there clearly people are, it's an issue that has been present, but I'm not sure if just saying in a policy you need to have a domain-specific repository identifier as well is pushing it enough. But I think looking into policies, as I had done recently for various grants, it's interesting. A lot of policies mandate things, a lot of policies only suggest things, but this is where often the top-down pressure is in terms of getting researchers to, quotes, put things in the right place.
Yeah, and one can almost see it as an unintended negative consequence of the requirement to have a persistent identifier for a data set when you are publishing a paper.
Yes, so often you see in data availability statements, don't you, that there's this whole lovely string of DOIs, but they essentially are a DOI with a file name and some, authors. So that's not nothing, but that's essentially all you get in terms of metadata, which is good for the preservation, perhaps, but not for the findability or the usability. Yeah. Anyway, it's an interesting discussion.
I would say it's not good for preservation.
Yeah.
I mean, and in social science, what we see, this is also maybe a little out of scope of this, but I just want to point out things like we like to have legal operations, so we stick to GDPR. And that's why some researchers tend to bypass our practices and publish on Zenodo, and that's not good for anybody, really, in the end.
Yeah, it's tricky. It's a tricky discussion. I find that this discussion we're having now is very interesting. I'm also aware that, although not required, we haven't looked at the other open questions, and we have just a few minutes left. But rather than pushing those open questions, perhaps if you could, Lisa, go back 2 slides, so there's just a slightly related question about anything that might be backwards 2 slides. Yeah, that's the one. Thank you. That's the slightly related to this, which is there anything that might be applicable to technical service providers that doesn't apply to the repositories as we have described them? And thinking about that as we sort of provide a wrap up, is that what the final thing is there? Do we want a few minutes of wrap up, or do we want to just finish off this discussion?
I think a wrap up would be useful.
Shall I give that honor to them? You're unmuted, so you can go ahead and do you have any particular words of wisdom to do a wrap up?
Yeah, not necessarily, but yeah, thank you very much. I think apart from the useful detailed input, of course, the broad takeaway for us is to try and limit the complexity and ambitions of the working group as much as possible. I think the first phase where we should look as broadly as possible in terms of requirements and expectations of the user community. But then in the follow-up phases, we really have to focus and only take on what is achievable within the time frame of the working group. And I think that's probably what we'll try and do, is to, after that initial landscape review, focus as much as possible on a few tangible outputs that are achievable. So the other aspect, of course, is that we will be contacting you for contributions to the working group. Otherwise, we end up with the co-chairs doing all the work. So once we've structured our work a bit better and the case statement has been accepted, hopefully it will be, then we'll certainly be in touch with everyone that attended the sessions, together with some of the usual suspects that we know about, to ask them to participate and contribute to the working group to their best ability. So thank you very much for your inputs and engagement and close attention to what was being presented. So it was really good for us to get this level of detailed feedback.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all. And from I put the link to the collaborative notes again. So if you haven't signed up yet, please do, so that Wim, Alison, Lauren, Max, and Mohan would have actually all the contact details of people to contact and invite to collaborate as part of the working group. So that would be great. Thank you.
Thanks, and thanks, Lisa.
Thanks, bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
I just wanted to say, I'm not sure, do you pronounce your name Wim or Vem? I've meant to ask.